I'm John McKee, editor of Messianic Apologetics, messianicapologetics.net. And I would like to welcome you to this episode of Messianic Insider, your theology and news roundup for December the 24th, 2025. Before we get into our material, I do have a few brief housekeeping items I would like to go through. There is not going to be a live stream or podcast for tomorrow or Friday. I've already announced that because I'm going to be involved with various family activities, as I'm sure many of you are as well. Likewise, there is not going to be a live stream or podcast on Monday. That would be December the 29th, because as I announced earlier in the week, a family friend has passed away, and I'm going to be involved in his funeral on Monday. So do be keeping this family in your prayers. This is one of our friends who we met almost immediately upon moving back to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex in 2013 or so, and his absence is going to be felt. But he was a veteran, 80 years old, good friend of ours, and just keep us in your prayers over the next few days. But I've definitely planned live stream podcasts for next Tuesday and Wednesday, and then Thursday we will be departing for Florida to attend the IAMCS Rabbis Conference. And then we'll just be switching over to McKee Moment when we are traveling. That's pretty consistent with what we've done in the past. All right, so if you have not already, here is something which I tweeted on X earlier today, and I would ask you to keep this in mind, especially because today is December the 24th. It is Christmas Eve, and many people are going to be involved in different religious activities. This is what I had to say. Regardless of what you specifically think about what is going to be taking place tomorrow, there are going to be millions of people who are presented with some message about Jesus, Yeshua. These are men and women in this world who are severely hurting and are in need of supernatural change. Pray for a particular unknown person to have a dynamic encounter with the living Messiah. And I can tell you that this past week, I've been praying for someone in particular who I don't know, but whose name came up from one of the materials I've got in my resource library. I just got this, significant impression to pray for this person, pray for their salvation, pray that they have a dynamic encounter with Jesus, because there are people all over the world who need salvation. And how do you know that you're not the only person right now who's praying for that person who is seeking answers and is seeking help? You might be the only person who is divinely tapped to, pray for this person and see that they come into the kingdom as a new child of God. So, we need to be keeping that in mind over the next few days as people are presented with some message about Yeshua. All right, so let's get into our theology roundup. And today we're going to be going into our archives, Outreach Israel News from June of 2024, a balancing act. And this is something which I think is very important as we consider, we talked about what is the new covenant, significance of the Messiah event, status of Torah, and now we're going to be talking about a balancing act. Yesterday we talked about what is a Torah foundation. Okay, so if you will turn with me to the Messianic Apologetics website. Okay, and I hope you do take advantage of all the information on the site. So here you have the articles tab, click on OIM News. These are all in chronological order. The newest is listed first. So we're going to go down to June of 2024. Click there, a balancing act. And look, I already looked through this information. Even though this newsletter was sent out a year and a half ago, these things are still pretty consistent with what we see in the Messianic sphere of influence. Okay, and I think many of you are going to get something significant out of this. A balancing act, and this was later reproduced in the updated, no, actually it would have been excerpted, I'm sorry, from the updated Torah in the Balance Volumes 1 and 2 combination book. Okay, in the mid-2020s, when surveying the broad world of religion, the Judeo-Protestant tradition, far too many people you encounter are likely to be imbalanced and unstable than balanced and stable. When many believers from conservative backgrounds look at the condition of much of Christianity, to be sure, they see a train which is running hopelessly off track. A great deal of non-Orthodox Judaism, likewise, seems far more interested in aligning itself with the world. The negative forces of progressivism, wokeism, and affirming have wreaked unspeakable damage to those looking to the God of the Bible over the past several years. When many sincere believers have witnessed a great deal of this havoc, they have understandably wanted to make sure that they have turned to a strong ethical and moral foundation in the Tanakh scriptures or Old Testament. Indeed, it can be logically observed. Would we be even having some of the debates present about abortion or homosexuality if we had a better appreciation for the law of Moses? Probably not. In 2003, when Torah in the Balance Volume 1 was released, I closed this installment with a chapter entitled Toward Toropolis. The point I was trying to stress was based in Ephesians 2:11 through 13, and believers in Israel's Messiah all being part of the Politeia, or Commonwealth of Israel. A polis, or city in the classical sense, also indicated a way of life in a society. And so Jewish and non-Jewish believers in Yeshua should see themselves as part of a society which looks to God's Torah as its constitution. To be sure, though, the instruction of Moses' teaching contains far more than just commandments and directions. It also includes foundational accounts of the creation, fall, flood, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Exodus, wilderness sojourn of Israel, and their arrival at the Promised Land. In the Jewish tradition, the Torah is an annual document to be considered every year. In much of today's Messianic movement, we read through the Torah portions, not just for what they communicate regarding ancient Israel, but also for their significance regarding the ministry and work of Yeshua of Nazareth. And as obvious as it may be, it is fair to say that today in 2023, 2024, by extension even 2025, going into 2026, many of us are going to start reading the Torah, Tanakh, and indeed all of Holy Scripture, much more from the perspective of it containing warnings of mistakes not to be repeated. 1 Corinthians 11:11, Revised Standard Version. I think many people across the Messianic community today have a broad appreciation for the role that the Torah is to play as a foundation for their theology and understanding of God's Word. This hardly means that there are not continuing challenges. After 2 decades since Torah in the Balance Volume 1 was originally released, how much closer are we to the arrival of Toropolis? Do the men and women, Jewish and non-Jewish, of today's Messianic movement compose a body politic of those who appreciate Moses' teaching and embody its principles of love, justice, and holiness so as to make a concentrated difference in the world? Or has some mention or usage of Torah more likely become a means to divide from one's evangelical Protestant brothers and sisters, and also others internally within the Messianic sphere of influence, creating sub-movements, factions, and cliques. A balanced walk of faith with the principles of God's Torah supernaturally implanted onto a new heart and mind via the power of the new covenant. Jeremiah 31, 31 to 34, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, Hebrews 8, 8 through 12, is hardly something impossible. Deuteronomy 30, verse 11, does direct after all. For this commandment which I command you today is not too difficult for you, nor is it out of reach. New American Standard. Being a mature believer, able to balance a proper inward morality with various outward observances, is something I have been able to witness many Messianic people do properly. They want to please the Lord in their external actions, including major Torah observances, like remembering the seventh-day Sabbath, Shabbat, the appointed times or Moedim, and eating a kosher style of diet, but also recognize the paramount importance of love for God and neighbor as the foremost of all commandments. Still, because of the limitations of much of our human condition, and mortal agendas and opportunism being what they are, maintaining a balanced walk of faith tempered by the principles of God's Torah can be difficult. Did matters of Torah really take off? In the very early years of Outreach Israel Ministries, I remember how my stepfather, Mark Huey, in reviewing the unique circumstances of our family being called into the Messianic movement, held to the strong belief that everyone would want to do this. In his estimation, when looking at the biblical and historical evidence that the first followers of Israel's Messiah were Torah-observant Jewish believers and non-Jewish believers within the sphere of influence of the Jewish community. Why would anyone not want to live a Torah-obedient life like the Messiah? In his view, would this not maximize the blessings one would experience as a believer today? Why not? Would not any mature believer in the Messiah of Israel want to live the most like him? The fact of the matter is that throughout the 2000s to 2010s, there was indeed an inevitable explosion of non-Jewish people similar to our own family, which found themselves considering things of Torah via a variety of circumstances, ranging from being exposed to concepts like Jesus and the feasts, reading Matthew 5, 17 through 19, or even wanting a better handle on Israel and prophecy. Many non-Jewish people found themselves entering into Messianic Jewish congregations as we originally had in 1995. A wide number of these people are still a part of the Messianic movement today. Some, for a number of reasons, only lasted in the Messianic movement for a few years and returned to their previous church settings. Perhaps many more non-Jewish people, when entering into the Messianic movement, found themselves offended for any number of ways and/or were influenced by various spin-off movements. Most notably, 2 house and 1 Torah or 1 law, and eventually left. Unfortunately, a number of these non-Jewish people may have found themselves not treated as the equals of Jewish believers in Messianic congregations and synagogues, accelerating their departure, although each situation is obviously different. The 2000s to 2010s witnessed the emergence of what is today widely known as the Hebrew Roots movement, various pro-Torah associations of non-Jewish people, although it is theologically witnessed that its beliefs and emphases are all over the board. Unlike the Messianic Jewish movement, which despite some of its own challenges, still largely focuses on the mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, and Israel solidarity, there really is no set mission of the Hebrew Roots movement. For sure, there are many sincere non-Jewish believers involved in the Hebrew roots movement who have embraced their faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel. Yet, a great deal of the Hebrew roots movement has stigmatized itself by being overly negative and condemning to the positive contributions of evangelical Protestantism and even the Jewish synagogue. In the mid to late 2010s, huge sectors of those identifying as Hebrew roots were found to severely question, if not deny, the divinity of Yeshua, the status of the inspiration of the apostolic writings or New Testament, especially the Pauline epistles, is always under question. And many Hebrew roots advocates do support a flat earth, among other problematic issues. Many are anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist. Today in 2024, and yes, even 2025, going into 2026, the majority of the people you will see being involved with matters of Torah and who are non-Jewish are likely to be involved in some sector of the Hebrew roots movement. While prophetically it is true that the nations are going to stream to Zion in the last days and be instructed from Moses' teaching, Micah 4:1-3, Isaiah 2:2-4. How many of the non-Jewish people involved in Hebrew roots were sincerely convicted by the Holy Spirit as a matter of their progression in the New Covenant, that various outward matters of God's Torah were important for them to consider? How many of them were tempered by a great love and burden for the salvation of the Jewish people and being co-laborers with Jewish believers in the redemption of Israel? Romans 15:27. How many more of them fell prey to sensational Christianity is pagan rhetoric and to substandard and harmful teachings not designed to truly edify believers in God's grace and mercy? Factional clashes. A great deal of the theological and apologetics challenges of the 2000s to 2010s came from the massive influx of non-Jewish people into the orbit of things Messianic. For sure, many non-Jewish believers were being legitimately called into the Messianic movement, little different than how the Moabitess Ruth declared, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." Ruth 1:16b-17a, Tree of Life version. These non-Jewish believers, while perhaps first entering into the Messianic movement via wanting to connect to worthwhile practices, such as remembering Shabbat, Yeshua in the feasts, or study the weekly Torah portions, would also be seen to serve alongside of Jewish believers as co-laborers in Jewish evangelism and the salvation of Israel. Many others, however, would be seen to get involved in Messianic things for other reasons, some more sensational than not, and contributed to the rise of spin-off movements such as Two House and One Law or One Torah. Not enough non-Jewish believers exposed to the Messianic Jewish movement realize this, but the Messianic movement was not originally set up as a Torah movement. The Messianic movement was originally set up as a community where Messianic Jewish believers could express their faith in Yeshua without having to give up on their Jewish heritage or traditions, as has been expected of them during the many centuries of Christianity. Yet, the first believers in Yeshua as Messiah were all Jews. The nexus of salvation history on this planet is Israel. Messianic Jewish congregations were to facilitate the mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, Israel solidarity, and be places where Jewish believers could raise their families in an environment styled after the synagogue. As obvious as it might be, this would prevent assimilation and keep Messianic Jewish progeny Jewish. For sure, various non-Jewish believers would be expected to attend and be part of Messianic congregations. Many Jewish believers in Yeshua, after all, have non-Jewish spouses. friends and allies of Israel have always had a place in the Messianic Jewish movement. Many non-Jewish believers have understood the original Messianic Jewish vision, but others have not. As an emerging spiritual movement, Messianic Judaism is hardly perfect, and it has gone through seasons of difficult growing pains. Not all Messianic Jewish congregations and fellowships are welcoming of non-Jewish believers, and a number of Messianic Jewish venues may be seen to treat non-Jews as second class. Issues of equality between Jewish and non-Jewish believers are likely to be present until the Messiah returns. Galatians 3:28. Various spin-off sub-movements were seen to arise, initially intending to be places where equality between Jewish and non-Jewish believers could be better manifested. The two-house sub-movement arose, largely in response to the emphasis on physical Jewish identity, positing that the reason so many non-Jewish people had been drawn into the Messianic movement was because they were actually members of the lost tribes of the exiled northern kingdom of Israel or Ephraim. Supporters of two-house wanted a physical connection to Israel too, but two-house quickly got mired in lost tribe speculation, tall tales, and British Israelism, as well as one major proponent supporting polygamy. Also answering the question of why many non-Jewish people have been drawn to things of Torah has been the one law or one Torah sub-movement. It posited that non-Jewish believers should be approached as though they were gerim or sojourners, outsiders who entered into the community of Israel and who were bidden some level of Torah observance. Deuteronomy 31:12. This was far less provocative than the claims of two-house. But the one law, one Torah sub-movement has been stigmatized by a great deal of inflexibility, legalism, and in failing to recognize that native and sojourner in ancient Israel, while having more in common than not, were not 100% identical. To be sure, many leaders in the Messianic Jewish movement have issued disapproving statements and papers to these sub-movements. These white papers have raised many legitimate negative points, but on the whole, they have also made resolving some of the questions raised by two-house and one law or one Torah much more difficult for those engaged in apologetics. And much of what was seen as two-house and one law or one Torah in the 2000s, in the 2010s, got widely amalgamated together as the more generic Hebrew roots. The most significant focus of the modern Messianic Jewish movement is that it is a faith community which has decisively placed itself on the salvation historical trajectory of Romans chapters 9 through 11. As Romans 11, 25 through 27, so astutely summarizes, "For I do not want you, brothers and sisters, to be ignorant of this mystery, lest you be wise in your own estimation, that a partial hardening has happened to Israel until the fullness of the nations has come in. And in this way all Israel will be saved, just as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion, he will remove ungodliness from Jacob. And this is my covenant with them when I take away their sins." Isaiah 59, 20 and 21, Septuagint. Isaiah 27:9, Septuagint, Jeremiah 31, 33 to 34, Psalm 14:7. Romans 11, 25 to 27, author's rendering. While the Messianic movement has placed itself onto a Romans chapters 9 through 11 salvation historical trajectory, it will also have to doubtlessly reckon with other prophecies. Some of the most obvious of these are Micah 4, 1 through 3, and Isaiah 2, 2 through 4, which are traditionally recalled during the morning Shabbat service as the Torah is brought forth from the ark. It would be difficult to deny in the mid-2020s that the prophecies of non-Jewish people from the nations being taught from the truths of God's Torah are not taking place throughout the broad Messianic community. When actually fulfilled, these prophecies indicate how there is to be worldwide peace and absence of war. Unfortunately, the issue of non-Jewish believers in matters of God's Torah has tended to bring anything but shalom, and has more often fueled divisions, factions, mistrust, bitterness, and instability. People from all of the varied sub-movements mentioned are likely to be found attending Messianic Jewish congregations and conference-level events, certainly across North America. How we actually return to a better path, where the original Messianic Jewish mission is being accomplished, and where non-Jewish believers can be properly equipped as co-laborers alongside their fellow Jewish believers, is not going to be easy. Yet, it is what I know many of us all recognize is required in order for us to move forward into the purposes the Lord has for us. What have we each given up? Recognizing the significant mandate today's Messianic movement has been entrusted with by the Lord, it should not at all be surprising to witness how navigating around human limitations necessarily occupies a great deal of a Messianic person's time and energy. When we look back at what has taken place since the late 1960s to the present, we have indeed witnessed not only a generation of Jewish people come to faith in Yeshua as the Messiah of Israel, but they have been responsible for seeing Messianic congregations and synagogues planted across the world as places where Jewish believers can believe in Yeshua and maintain their Jewish heritage. The Messianic Jewish pioneers have rightly seen fit to solicit evangelical Christian support of the Messianic mission of Jewish outreach, evangelism, and Israel solidarity. And perhaps as an unforeseen consequence, many non-Jewish believers in Israel's Messiah have embraced their faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel in very tangible ways, even with some of the tensions caused by the independent Hebrew or Hebraic roots movement. There are many thousands of non-Jewish believers who have been genuinely called and assigned by the Lord to serve alongside their fellow Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel in Messianic congregations. To be sure, it has to be recognized that in making a profession of faith in Yeshua as the Messiah of Israel, many Jewish believers have endured incredible persecution and ostracism. Many Jewish believers need a Messianic congregation or synagogue to be a place of refuge and solace where they can be among their fellow Jewish believers who have experienced some of the same hardships as they. Many Jewish believers, extended Jewish families, certainly consider them to be crazy for accepting Yeshua, or may no longer consider them Jewish. Historically, Jewish people who have recognized Yeshua as Messiah are no longer considered to be Jews by much of the synagogue establishment. A great deal of evangelical Protestantism today, while often permitting scores of various ethnic denominations and churches, actually does not want to see Jewish believers in Yeshua have their own congregations which observe Shabbat, biblical and Jewish festivals, and perform life cycle traditions such as bar or bat mitzvah or brit milah, circumcision. Many Christians want Jewish believers to become part of the greater church community and assimilate, effectively disappearing from the scene. Messianic Judaism has been entirely right to establish its own communities for Jewish believers. There are many evangelical, non-Jewish believers who see the importance of Messianic Jewish congregations. While one might think that Messianic Jewish congregations and synagogues are to be places for Jewish people only, The fact of the matter is that a large minority of marriages taking place in conservative and Reformed Jewish settings are intermarriages, and non-Jewish people do frequent conservative and Reformed temples. Non-Jewish believers being involved in Messianic Jewish congregations in many ways parallels that of what is taking place in much of conservative and Reformed Jewish settings. With only a handful of exceptions I am aware of, on the whole, North American Messianic Judaism wants to simply stress whether or not a non-Jewish believer drawn into a Messianic congregation is truly called by the Lord to be there. The main purpose of the Messianic congregation or synagogue is Jewish ministry. Can a non-Jewish believer, while being enriched by his or her faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel, also be committed as a co-laborer in the Messianic mission? One of the things which I remember our family experienced back in the late 1990s was a seeming lack of reciprocation, as our family was fully committing itself to the Messianic movement and a Torah-observant lifestyle. We were properly asked, as non-Jewish believers, by various Messianic Jewish leaders, to be sensitive to the needs, difficulties, and hardships faced by Messianic Jews. Rejection from the Jewish community, dismissed from one's family, being regarded as no longer Jewish, and now Gentile because of belief in Jesus. We were taught to be very careful with some of the English terms we might use from customary Christian jargon, such as cross or baptize, and instead employ alternatives like execution stake or immerse, because they might offend Jewish people. We were asked to be very conscientious of Christian anti-Semitism and be committed to a further education in matters of Judaism, Jewish tradition, and Jewish culture. And indeed, these were all completely understandable and justifiable. As non-Jewish believers, we were simply asked to put ourselves into the place of Messianic Jewish believers, be aware of the difficulties they faced in coming to Yeshua faith, and note the challenges which Jewish non-believers will have when they come into a Messianic congregation. The great difficulty we frequently experienced in our early Messianic days of 1995 and 1996 is that while non-Jewish believers in Messianic congregations were asked to recognize what Jewish believers have often given up in coming to faith in Yeshua, was that there was often little to no reciprocation with what non-Jewish believers have given up in becoming Messianic. When a non-Jewish believer enters into the Messianic movement, he or she will be seen to adapt a new lifestyle involving Shabbat, the appointed times, a kosher style of diet, and will be anchored to matters of Israel and the Jewish people. Many will leave established Protestant denominations for a still developing and still maturing Messianic movement, which can be too fundamentalist at times. Many will give up sacred family memories by concluding that traditional holidays such as Christmas and Easter were inauthentic to the first believers in the Messiah. Many will give up treasured family recipes because they contain pork or shellfish. Many single non-Jewish believers who enter into the Messianic movement or grew up Messianic because their parents brought them into it at a young age have great difficulty because of the small size of this faith community finding a compatible husband or wife. Being cut off from a great deal of the evangelical community and finding oneself in the Messianic community has a wide degree of tensions for non-Jewish believers, and that is why one has to often be uniquely called. While I know of many Messianic Jewish believers who recognize the difficulties non-Jews can have in entering into the Messianic movement, and will offer a degree of reciprocation for what families like mine have given up, this is not as frequent as it should be. Indeed, my family has chosen to stay Messianic when we have seen other non-Jewish believers not even last 3 years. Others, while seeing the value in being connected to and enriched by the Messianic movement, choose to do a kind of Messianic light, staying an evangelical Protestant who regularly attends church, but who may seasonally attend a Messianic congregation at seasons such as Passover or the fall high holidays, or who may remember Hanukkah while still being firmly involved in Christmas. To be certain, each individual and family is different, but the difficulties non-Jewish believers face in being fully committed to a Messianic lifestyle need to be better recognized and appreciated by many more Messianic Jewish believers moving forward. What division are we witnessing now? It is unfortunate to say this, but many throughout the Messianic sphere of influence have indeed forgotten what the original call and purpose of the Messianic movement actually was. How many today, within the orbit of things Messianic, even bother to really mention the original mandate of Jewish outreach, evangelism, and Israel solidarity? Probably not enough. This is a missional vocation deeply rooted within the themes of Romans chapters 9 through 11, intending to answer the apostles' question, Lord, are you restoring the kingdom to Israel at this time? Acts 1:6, Tree of Life version. The fact that more is taking place than just the salvation of the Jewish people proper, with non-Jewish believers embracing their faith heritage in the scriptures of Israel, now the majority of persons within the Messianic movement have complicated things, but not unnecessarily so. Many of these people have been genuinely called by the Lord into the Messianic movement to serve as co-laborers beside Jewish believers in the salvation of Israel. But being the majority, non-Jewish issues and challenges involving matters of Torah have too often eclipsed legitimate Jewish issues needing to be addressed. Some course corrections are going to have to be made in the not too distant future. Division, factions, rivalry, and mistrust are all unfortunate predicaments, perhaps worst epitomized by the situation Paul had to regulate in Corinth. 1 Corinthians 1, 12, and 13. Having one faction, group, or sub-movement break off are matters which have been witnessed throughout a great deal of religious history. Some division over major matters of theology can be necessary, i.e., dividing over a Calvinist or Arminian soteriology. That's the study of salvation, by the way. But many divisions do not take place over theology, but over differences of personality. Because of its numbers, theological and spiritual divisions which exist in a great deal of evangelical Protestantism can be much more easily managed. There are a few evangelical denominations whose official numbers actually exceed the total number of Jewish people on planet Earth today, around 17 to 18 million. Today's Messianic Jewish movement, because of its minute size in comparison, cannot easily handle divisions and factionalism, because people will often quickly find out about new splits and groups forming. And the Messianic movement loves to talk. While not impossible, those serving in the field of apologetics have to carefully and diplomatically often learn to navigate and maneuver around some of the short-sightedness of the religious politics and spiritual culture too many have been harmed by. And what do religious politics and machinations actually do? They cause us to waste energy, resources. They weaken us, and they keep us away from the real work we should be performing for the kingdom of God. When you cannot fairly resolve a theological or spiritual matter within a faith community and a faction or schism erupts, those who are harmed are less likely to stand by you when a major substantive attack hits. Okay. Today, as we enter into the mid-2020s, and this was me writing on the 27th of November, 2023, so a little more than 2 years ago, There are two old issues seen since the early 2000s which continue to divide and split far too many Messianic people. And I'd say this is the case today, a little more than 2 years later. Has non-Jewish Torah observance really provoked Jewish people to jealousy, Romans 10:11, for Messiah faith? Not to the extent many think it has. This has often been because the majority of non-Jewish Hebrew rooters are more concerned only about outward matters of Torah minutiae and not that concerned about being sensitive to legitimate Jewish struggles. How many Hebrew roots ministries and groups are actually seen to stand against anti-Semitism and support both Zionism and the state of Israel, doing things of Torah, but not caring much about what the Jewish community cares about, says a great deal. Romans 11:18-22. How many Hebrew roots groups have actually stayed silent in the face of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism when many evangelical Protestants have not? And here's another question. Is the identity of a Messianic Jew to be principally found in his or her Jewish ethnicity and heritage, or in who the Messiah of Israel is? Philippians 3:3-11. While the preservation and continuity of Jewish identity is doubtlessly important, the Messianic community has to be able to service a salvation historical mission of heralding the return of Yeshua the Messiah and second coming. Those who would want to see the Messianic movement become another formal branch of Judaism have completely missed the major vocation this faith community should all be about accomplishing. New issues and divisions are also starting to flare up, which have at the center of controversy the issue of non-Jewish believers and outward matters of Torah. 2020 to 2021 witnessed the rise of a new sub-movement, pronomian Christianity. The term pronomian, although many of you will hear it pronounced pronomian, I was always taught that nomos, the Greek term for law, omicron, pronounced as a short O. So that's why I say pronomian. The term pronomian simply means pro-law. And so technically, anyone who has a favorable view of the Torah or law of Moses is a lowercase p pronomian. But those who have specifically labeled themselves as capital P pronomian are often a collection of former Hebrew rooters who recognize that the Hebrew roots movement has gone too far in much of its anti-Christian rhetoric, and that Protestantism has more of a positive legacy for Torah positive people to benefit from than previously acknowledged. In particular, theological traditions which have looked to the Torah for moral and ethical guidance. Another group, also composing capital P pronomianism, are those who have identified as one law or one Torah, but have now chosen to have very little to do with Judaism or mainstream Jewish tradition. It is appreciable that pronomianism wants to eschew the anti-Christian culture of much of Hebrew roots, but how favorable pronomianism is going to be to Judaism and matters of modern Israel is likely going to be a huge question. If formal pronomianism does not take firm stances against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and demonstrate some degree of positivity to the Messianic Jewish movement, then it is likely to have various claims of supersessionism or replacement theology lodged against it. Speaking entirely for myself, I think that the emergence of pronomian Christianity has made things more complicated than not, with a new sub-movement coming onto the scene. And to be fair, there are people who identify as capital P pronomian who have stood against anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and a lot of the things which we have even seen from Christian nationalism. It is still developing. At least a few sectors of the Messianic Jewish community are beginning to positively sort through that large numbers of non-Jewish believers compose formal Messianic Judaism, often making up the majority of persons in Messianic Jewish congregations and synagogues, being included in local leadership. While many, I believe, recognize non-Jewish believers as their equals in Messiah and spiritual allies, and are mainly concerned about whether such persons are genuinely called by the Lord into the Messianic movement, others are going to be seen to manifest various insecurities and believe that their uniqueness as Jewish people is being infringed upon. In 2021, it was claimed by some others in the Messianic Jewish movement that by non-Jewish believers doing outward things of Torah like Shabbat or the Feast of Tabernacles in anticipation of the future, Isaiah 66:23, Zechariah 14:16 through 17, that they were holding to an overly realized eschatology and doing things to be only reserved for the future, subsequent to the second coming of the Messiah. While issues of whether a non-Jewish person is genuinely called by God into the Messianic experience are legitimate, the claim that millennial kingdom prophecies should stay entirely constrained to the millennium has a major problem to it. Various prophecies of the future kingdom also detail the riches of the nations streaming to Zion, partially because of restitutions for wrongs and atrocities committed against Israel. Isaiah 45:14, 60 verses 5 through 17, 61:6, Micah 4:13, also Tobit 13:11, 1 QM 12:13 and 15. That's Dead Sea Scrolls. Theologians have often recognized these expectations as forming the basis of Paul's collection offering mission, Romans 15:25 and 26, 2 Corinthians 8:13 and 14. And many of today's large Messianic Jewish ministries definitely use Tanakh or Old Testament prophecies of the wealth of the nation streaming to Zion to promote their own fundraising endeavors. Does this need to stop until the millennial kingdom as well? Of course not. The claim of overly realized eschatology may indeed be seen to be based in some Messianic Jews' insecurity and an unwillingness for many to step up and be part of a truly end-time move of God, turning away allies of Israel when they do not have to. As obvious as it may be, the old issues and the new factions do very little to facilitate stability, trust, and mutual respect. Romans 12:10 in the body of Messiah. Instead, they are seen to induce tensions and cause theological brush fires in constant need of being extinguished. They take one's time away from being able to focus on major controversial matters for which the Messianic community is poorly prepared. Among other things, 2020 to 2023, and this extends to today, almost 2026, has seen the emergence of wokeism across both Judaism and Christianity, and with it, millennials and Generation Z being largely influenced by a hyper-progressive and liberal ideology. Young people are going through a process of what has become labeled as deconstruction, which while on paper is to involve the inclusion of new and marginalized persons and perspectives, in practice largely involves radically purging a conservative theological and spiritual framework. If today's Messianic movement purports to have a Torah foundation for its theology, focused around its fulfillment in Messiah, Matthew 5:17 through 19, then we should seemingly be more than ready to implement its principles of holiness and righteousness, having the answers to the legitimate questions posed by wokeism. Unfortunately, we have been spending far too much of our time being sidetracked and distracted by those with particular agendas and insecurities. We largely do not have the big picture view of what the God of Israel is doing as we think we do. A balancing act. The very purpose I released a Torah in the Balance Volume 2 was to address the importance of various outward practices of God's Torah. The Lord desires that his people be whole, first in terms of their inward heart morality, Matthew 5:8, and secondly in terms of the whole human being, 1 Thessalonians 5:23. There are many mature men and women in today's Messianic movement, Jewish and non-Jewish, who are able to balance a stellar inward morality with appropriate outward actions. They recognize the centrality of the work of Yeshua to their personal identity and can properly fellowship as one in him in mixed diaspora congregations, representative of the one new man or humanity, Ephesians 2:15. They are committed as brothers and sisters in Yeshua to the salvation historical trajectory of Romans chapters 9 to 11, being active in matters of Jewish outreach and evangelism, and in seeing non-Jewish believers partake of their faith heritage in Israel's scriptures as a matter of their further growth in sanctification. In the year 2024, and this extends 2025 into 2026 even, there are many true Messianic believers who are able to have a balanced Torah-observant walk of faith. Their obedience to God's Torah is a result of the work of the New Covenant, Jeremiah 31 to 34, Ezekiel 36, 25 to 27, in their lives. Some of this has not come without some growing pains, or even seasons of severe spiritual correction from our Heavenly Father. None of us are immune to having gone through periods where we have had to admit to our various mistakes, make corrections, and testify to how the Lord used various difficulties to improve our effectiveness in his service. We possibly find ourselves in what may be a very disconcerting time for the broad Messianic movement. Many of the challenges of the past continue to plague us. The baby boomers and those of Generation X, while helping to build the Messianic movement, have not been too willing to recognize and properly address the challenges faced by millennials, Generation Z, and now Generation Alpha. In the future, more of the controversies involving the Torah will concern significant ethical and moral issues debated by institutional Judaism and Christianity, and less of the identity matters the Messianic Jewish pioneers had to sort through. I do believe that with God's help, today's Messianic people will be able to perform the work and divine assignments which he has for us. And so today, on December the 24th, I issue a number of these challenges to you because there are many people who are hurting in today's world, and they are going to be encountering some message about Jesus. They're going to be hearing some message about God being born as a human baby, and then later growing up, having 12 disciples, and then being sacrificed on the tree for human sin. And believe me, I hope you have one or two people who you know or do not know, who you are praying for right now, that they encounter the living Messiah. But yet, we know this time of year, Messianic community does tend to have some difficulties, not quite knowing how to properly appreciate the themes of Hanukkah, light of the world and all of that, and then how we encounter Christians doing Christmas on December the 25th. And unfortunately, even to this day, after 3 decades, we still cannot easily address the whole matter of the nativity, Yeshua born into the world. Whether we see the world doing it on December the 25th, you try to do it during the season of Sukkot, the Feast of Tabernacles, or even whether you do it during the Torah reading of Shemot, the first Torah reading of the book of Exodus, which, of course, you see the birth of Moses, and that parallels the birth of Yeshua. Still is very difficult to address this. But we live in a time as we close up calendar year 2025 and look to 2026. What are we doing? What changes do we have to make? And what things are going to have to be different? And I know that I raise these questions all the time, and sometimes they're addressed pretty well. Sometimes not so much. All right, so let's, that concludes our theology roundup. We do have some news to go through. And we do the news roundup after the theology roundup because, of course, the news is time sensitive and it changes from day to day. We are reminded to, number one, be continually praying for peace, Israel, Gaza, the Middle East. Number two, be praying for peace, Russia and Ukraine. And number three, be praying for reason and sanity to prevail here on the American home front, among all the other things we've got to be praying for right now. Okay, so all the links I'm about to go through, these will be available for you to look at later today when this episode is archived at MessianicApologetics.net. Okay, our first story, and this is from Open Source Intel yesterday afternoon, December the 23rd, and there's a 1-minute, 23-second clip. The U.S. told the UN Security Council that President Trump is open to direct talks with Iran, reaffirming that zero enrichment remains Washington's official stance. And of course, along with that, we are reminded that Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, is supposed to be coming to the U.S. soon, probably going to have a meeting with President Trump at Mar-a-Lago. What's going to be discussed there, we're not entirely sure, but are we going to see a round two with Iran? I don't want to see it. I know most people don't want to see it, but it's definitely something being talked about. Okay, so Russia, Ukraine. Now, this is from the New York Post on X, December the 23rd. This is from yesterday. Zelensky warns Putin may be plotting Christmas strike on Kiev as hopes for holiday miracle truce fade. Okay, so I know a lot of us recognize that we're coming up on the 4-year mark for the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And there are all these different factors which have gone into this. But we have got to be praying for peace, because the people who really lose in this conflict, not just as you see a generation of Ukrainians, a generation of Russians being lost, but there are huge Messianic Jewish communities in both Ukraine as well as Russia, and they're the ones who ultimately suffer from this whole ordeal. So we need to be praying for a resolution to this. And there's another story we're going to be mentioning in just a moment about this. Okay, to the American home front, the Western Hemisphere. Now, this is from ABC News. On X yesterday afternoon, President Trump is continuing to ratchet up pressure on Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, saying it would be smart for him to step down and warning him not to play tough. Okay, so once again, what's going to happen with that naval buildup in the Southern Caribbean with attention directed to Venezuela? Venezuela being targeted as a narco-terrorist state, but of course, ultimately, what about the believers in Venezuela? What about the believers in the region? As I've mentioned, when I lived in Central Florida, I especially knew some people who had fled Venezuela because of its political disposition, and that's who we need to pray for. We'll see what happens over the next coming days and weeks. Okay, now here's one about the Epstein issue. And of course, we've been talking about the Epstein files being released. That's a story which is ongoing, just like any of the things which have been declassified by the Trump administration. The release of Epstein is going to take a while, and people having to sort through it. And we will plan to deal with issues as they come up on an issue-by-issue basis. But here's a big one. This is from the New York Post. Tech-savvy users discover a way around redacted parts of Jeffrey Epstein files. And I'm sorry that the text comes up the way it does here, but I am using the DuckDuckGo browser. But as various files, Epstein files get released, of course, there are going to be things which are redacted. And here, and this is not the only news venue which has picked that up, but people who are tech savvy, people who know how to use the different software, Well, can I see through what's being removed or being hidden from these documents, from these materials? If that's able to happen, that's going to create a lot of talk more than anything else. But it's going to get a lot of people asking more questions about this or that. Whether one is on the left or the right, I don't see how the release of the Epstein files is going to bring anything truly good. It's just going to cause people's trust in government, excuse me, persons of importance, entertainment, industry, etc., to plummet. This is why we can only trust God at this point. Okay, 3 more stories. Okay, this came across my feed from Open Source Intel this morning, posted at 4:24 a.m. Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky has revealed details of the latest U.S.-led plan to end the war in Ukraine, saying it had been agreed between negotiators from Kiev and Washington and sent to Moscow for feedback. So this includes a number of things in the latest back and forth regarding peace in Ukraine. And it includes, among other things, non-aggression, full and unconditional non-aggression pact with Russia, line of contact monitored via space-based systems to prevent violations, security guarantees. Ukraine receives strong security assurances from U.S., NATO, and European allies. Allied support. I'm just reading some of them. Guarantees mirror NATO Article 5. Sanctions reinstated if Russia attacks, nullified if Ukraine attacks without provocation. And EU membership, we're scrolling down, Ukraine to join EU within a defined period, privileged access to European markets during transition, free trade agreement with US to be accelerated. Programs to promote cultural understanding, minority rights, and combat racism, US religious tolerance standards adopted, EU, sorry. Territorial line, current troops positions in Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, I'm probably mispronounced those, I'm sorry, recognized working groups to manage redeployment and potential special economic zones. Future arrangements on agreements on territory cannot be altered by force. And then there's some other things here. So we'll see what happens. We know we've heard a lot of different proposals go back and forth between Russia and Ukraine, and President Trump, especially as he approaches 1 full year in office, he's very eager to see this conflict come to a conclusion. Now, we still have other things to keep in mind. This was interesting. This is also from Open Source Intel today, posted at 4:55 a.m. Russia aims to deploy a nuclear power plant on the moon within the next 10 years to support its lunar program and a joint Russian-Chinese research base as global powers intensify efforts to explore Earth's only natural satellite. Yes, and we are expecting within the next several months, by February, there's going to be some NASA mission which will orbit around the moon and return. We haven't seen that, of course, since the 1970s. The moon and resumed space exploration are going to be a big part of the mid to late 2020s and definitely into the 2030s. And then our final story, and this is from My Charisma, and this was definitely something worth passing on. This originally appeared on CBS News, but it's from December the 24th. Prophecy in action. Israeli foreign minister calls on Jews around the world to emigrate to Israel. So we know that there is rising anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the world. Of course, the biggest event we're still trying to sort through is the massacre at Bondi Beach, Australia. And against the backdrop of rising anti-Semitism, Israeli Foreign Minister Gideon Sa'ar is calling on Jews from a number of countries to make Aliyah. These include, I am calling on Jews in the United Kingdom, Australia, France, Canada, and Belgium to immigrate to Israel. Of course, the big country not listed there is the United States of America. But I have said this before, and I will say it again. If you are Messianic Jew, you are certainly a young Messianic Jew, you're in your 20s or your 30s, investigate, put out feelers. What would it take to make Aliyah? It's not going to hurt you to go to a couple of websites, get some information from the Israeli consulate or government to find out what it would take to make Aliyah. Not saying you have to make it, but you need to be putting feelers out there. You need to be monitoring this. There are plenty of Messianic Jewish believers I know who in the past several years, they have made Aliyah, or they've definitely looked into what it would take to get citizenship. Look, it's not going to hurt you, as I said, to just look into it, get some free literature, talk to somebody at the Israeli consulate, because what is going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years as we monitor things on the conservative right in America? What are some of the things we saw during AmFest last weekend? Put feelers out now. Do not wait. Learn some of the lessons of the 1930s. And yes, it does beg the question, is the Messianic movement the end-time move of God or not? And I know a lot of people don't want to hear that. They don't want to be thinking about the Messianic movement and prophecy, but it is something we need to start factoring into what we are all about. And it's not easy to sort through that, but it's something we're going to have to start doing more and more frequently. Okay, and that concludes our news roundup for today. As I said when we got started, there's not going to be a live stream podcast tomorrow or Friday because, like many of you, I'm going to be involved in family activities, and we're not going to have a live stream podcast on Monday either because I'm going to be attending a funeral. So please keep our friends in your prayers for comfort as we honor the memory of a departed soul. As always, on behalf of Messianic Apologetics, I would like to sincerely thank you for your ongoing prayers, encouragement, and support for all of our ministry efforts, especially those of you who have been led to give a special year-end offering. If you have not, please do visit my website, messianicapologetics.net. There you can access a wide array of articles, frequently asked questions entries, different back issues of Outreach Israel News. You can take a look at different back episodes of Messianic Insider, different McKee Moment short, and generally take a look at our ministry adventures from over the years. And please, if you have not, be sure to give this teaching a thumbs up or a heart. It'll help our exposure on social media. We will see you again soon with another episode of Messianic Insider. Until then, may God bless you. Shalom, and take care.